afternoon. Once again, it is my privilege and pleasure to come and spend these few moments of your time. As I have said, there are, shall we call them, nested layers of fields in which one can tune into, resonate with. The physical is, shall we say, one of the more condensed layers where, shall we say, the ideas and the intention come to rest. They are brought through the fields. Of course, anyone may tap into any of the fields, should they wish to, and have gained, shall we say, access by the level of consciousness agreed upon. So, shall we say, the new species already primarily tapping in, shall we call it, to the mental field of creativity. So, like everyone, you often tap in and gain insights or new ideas or many other interesting characteristics from that mental field. But you are not aware of the sharing. Shall we say, the new species are very aware that they are sharing their ideas and, shall we say, often add their own coding to it. That is, they have a signature that alerts others to where it arises from. So you understand when they are with others of the, shall we call them the oldest species, they are reading the thought characteristics prior to their speech. So obviously they are aware of all the lying that is going on. They can read what is happening and understand truth is not always what is, shall we say, expressed in the spoken word because of hidden agendas that are characteristic of the old school. Does that make sense? So, shall we say, the new species is transcending the idea of politics. Politics then is no longer relevant to the new species as they take hold. Enough to begin a conversation.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being with us again today. So last time we spoke, I asked you about how humans first started, how the originating first human cell began. I would like to review what I heard from you last time, if that's okay. So firstly, you said there was unity, a single framework that is unified. This is what we are working towards now. So this refers to us being created in the future, where a single unity framework operates from.
Shall we say, in the present, there is no time of course. You understand? So at the unity level of consciousness, that is where the field is a single element before differentiation. You understand? You often talk of integration. integration is coming together to find a singularity, and differentiation is the opposite end of the scale, where the unity begins to diversify into different characteristics and different relationships. This is what is known, shall we say, as the general theory of relativity. Not quite understood at the time. So, shall we say, everything arises from a unity, from the wholeness or oneness, and beyond that, of course, there are other layers and levels in the field. But as far as humankind and consciousness at this time is capable of understanding, shall we say, the integration to a unity and the differentiation into diversity. So, shall we say, as the first level of diversity appears, shall we say, you start to structure, should we call it a time coding, a timeline, where one level of diversity is at, shall we say, appearing to be future, and one layer appearing to be in the past, and yourselves within the present. But of course, when tomorrow arrives, you are still in the present. When 10 years go by, you are still in the present. And in your own time, since the beginning of Egyptian times, now you are still in the present. Nothing has changed. Always there is a future coming, and always there was the past. Do you understand what I mean? So the diversity where one sees oneself in present time arises from the differentiation. Does that make some sort of sense? And so there is a relativity between this one and that one. One is looking as though time must exist, but of course your great theory already proves that time and space are the same thing. They are the constant within the formula. Does that make some sort of sense?
Yeah.
So you can understand that as soon as time begins, there is a present and a future. And the only way that can occur is if there is a space for them to exist in. And so time and space cannot exist separately from one another.
When we discussed this, you said that everything starts from a concept or a conceptual idea, and that before the individual idea or solid form of the being, for lack of a better word, can manifest, it goes through a process much like building a house, drawing up the concept, designing and planning, etc.
Of course. First of all, there is the unification, that is, shall we call it, the integration. Within the integration, there is what we would call a systematic program, that is a grand intention. In the grand intention, there is a structure that must be organized. You cannot have differentiation, diversity, without organization and relativity. So shall we say there has to be a beginning and an end. One has to organize it, structure it, and draw up the plan. You understand? If it is, shall we say, a great battle, it is not random that one begins it. One has to have a plan. Otherwise, you will not achieve your goals, your ends. So the unity wishes to fulfill its purpose in diversification. If it did not have a purpose, then randomness would arrive. Do you understand? And the past would not be in order. So, shall we say, in 10 weeks' time, you will emerge from being, shall we call them, the apes. But that will be difficult because you have already decided it isn't like that. Do you understand what I mean? So the plan is to draw it up, to have a blueprint, and then to begin to achieve the blueprint. One has to drive, shall we call it, or inhabit the ideas. One has to begin to imagine how that would appear in reality. One has to condense it, and having condensed it and belonged to it, one starts to experience it. Experiencing it, of course, is where you begin to have intentions and desires and resistances and hatreds and so forth, and all of that thing, until it condenses into a solid reality. Then you are in the real world, as it were, the solid world, where one has to experience the result. At any point prior to that, you could change your mind. But once it has been solidified, it is no longer fluid. It is a bit like, shall we say, your butter, your fat. If you heat it up, it is fluid. It will flow around everything. But as soon as it is cold, it will solidify, and then it is a solid matter. Nothing can move in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So then you talked us through a bit more of a practical process where working out how the individual concept or being fits practically and interacts with each other, which you just mentioned, allowing for any agreements with others to be formed. At this point, an identity is created. And when you say an identity is created, are these other predetermined factors such as gender? Is that when it's assigned at this stage in the process?
Let us say this. Nothing is assigned. There are only choices made in the blueprint. One is testing different frameworks. Then one might test the water, as it were, in the blueprint. What if I were a man? What if this were a woman? What experience would be different? Taking that there is a distinct difference. Over time, some of this has been lost in the diversification, and sometimes there is confusion as to what experience one wishes to have. So one might wish to have a masculine experience while being in a feminine body. And that will cause whatever challenges that causes, just the same as anything else. One might then be attracted to one's own gender. And of course, the challenges that that produces, because nature is as it is. Do you understand what I mean? So you choose the characteristics and align those characteristics with, shall we say, the general frameworks that exist. For example, shall we say, at the galactic level of consciousness, the fields that represent that. One, shall we say, experiences the levels that are time-oriented in terms of great historical periods. Whether one wishes to be in medieval times, or whether one is future-oriented, whether one is turned to face one direction or another, one is one's positioning, then that is at the solar level. So characteristics of the solar interactions, the great spiritual guides and guardians of the planets as they interact and relate to one another within the general patterns of relativity, cause different characteristics to appear in an ordered sense. That is, shall we say, there is a code, and it is structured, so there is a pathway to return to the unity, shall we say, via consciousness. Does this make some sort of sense? So there are pathways to integration, various and different and useful. But they are, and one might choose which guide stones or guiding paths one might choose, but to arrive at integration where one can, shall we say, bring together all of the experiences of all beings. So, shall we say, if one has judgments on others, one can never arrive at integration. It requires that one ceases to believe one is, shall we say, uniquely better than anything else. You understand? So when one drops one's judgments and criticisms, one certainly opens up the deeper pathways towards that state of integration, which of course is a doorway to higher perspectives and higher fields.
Okay, thank you. So you also mentioned last week that the part of the process that is ensuring the solid formal being fits into time, the human timeline. The being has to have a past is the past of the being then adopted when the parents are chosen? So then it fits into that genetic timeline and path.
Of course, everything has to fit in the understanding and the fields that resonate, because it is a resonation. It is not, shall we call it, a determination. So, shall we say, one child may have a certain memory of their childhood. You understand? They have a certain memory, and then later in life, certain experiences occur when they realize that was not what happened at all. So they essentially change their history. Do you understand? They change what they remember, their memory of it, as if they forgot or misinterpreted or anything, rather than they simply changed their past. They slipped, shall we say, to a different reality, an alternative to what appeared to be solid. Do you follow what I mean?
Yeah, and when somebody does that, those that are around them also shift their memory of that person's past too.
Of course, and indeed many of those around them also shift their own lines as well, as if one shift affects the whole, of course, as it must, in terms of the relativity to keep the balance on track. You understand? So it is that if one person changes their perceptions of reality, everyone around them has to reorder. If they are incapable of reordering, then they will eliminate that person from their experience.
Wow. So if I wanted to go back and change some of my memories that aren't so positive, I can do so by choice?
Of course, because what are those memories? But they are ideas perpetuated and locked in solid form. But where are they locked in solid form? Not at the physical level, because that is in the past. And as I point out, there is only truly a present experience. Everything else was made up. Do you follow what I mean? It was made up out of a need to keep a, shall we say, an identity that is consistent. So consistency is the important thing. But there is no evidence in reality. That is only in the memory of the past. You understand, this is not popular, because if this were a popular perception, there could be no blame. And as soon as there is no blame, then one assumes responsibility. And as I have pointed out, you are in the realm of accepting responsibility, accountability, and transparency. not popular, of course. And even voicing this causes much concern for those who would, shall we say, like to keep it as it is, or even make profit from it being such a way.
Yeah. So if I wanted to change my memories, change my past, rewrite it, would it be a matter of focusing on other memories and let go of the not so good memories, or would there be a method or a practical guidance that you can offer that I can go and rewrite my past?
Shall we say, if you place your attention, that is your consciousness, and lift it to the place of agreement, that is where one agreed to have such an experience. In other words, who was involved and what agreements did everyone make? Then one might, shall we say, disagree. One said to the meeting room, as it were, no, I don't like this anymore. So I disagree, and we will have to renegotiate what has to have happened. Do you understand what I mean? Everyone then will re-look at their part playing in all of this, find a new order, shall we say, that will provide a different and more agreeable life experience in the past in terms of your present. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. So would you do that in meditation or hypnotherapy, or how would you go about that? Just a conversation in your mind?
Of course. Simply, shall we say, it is a meditation, because meditation is dropping the old systems, shall we say, until you arrive at the layers of consciousness where such agreements are organized. Do you understand? So you are imagining. It is not a good word. Imagining is used too much, as if the mental body can imagine anything. But shall we say, to lift oneself up to the places, if you like, the energy vortex. It is hard to express this because they are fields of existence. Do you understand? They are resonant fields that are vibrating at certain qualities. Does this make sense? So it is much higher, in many cases, almost to the degree of the original diversification, where one was designing one's uniqueness. Then, in the design of that uniqueness, one creates necessary, shall we call them, characteristics that interact with other people's designed characteristics in order to find conflict or harmony. And usually both. So you have some harmony and then some conflict and then some harmony, and you are, shall we say, polishing the stones, polishing up the gem that is at the heart of each other. If, however, one is a harder stone, shall we say, a harder rock, it will grind away the other to dust. And so there is often unresolvable conflict. Does this make some sort of sense?
Yeah.
And the longer one can stay in the heat, because when the grinding cause heat is generated, that is activity and energy that can be realized. In terms of the relationship of masculine and feminine, this is often dissipated in sexual activity. Because when the energy is high, the connection is greater, and the resultant desires are energized. This is what was called sexual magic in olden times.
I would also like to talk a little bit about understanding what's predetermined before in the human design phase and before we become a solid form. So is something like the timing of one's death predetermined before we are born?
Nothing is predetermined in terms of agreements and design. In other words, whatever is predetermined was decided prior to engaging or descending into solid form. There are some predetermined factors, of course, which is one will not stay in the physical form for longer periods than useful. In other words, one will pass out of the form once the usefulness of the vehicle has been attained. So often it appears as if someone might continue on even though others might judge them as useless, but that isn't the case for them. So shall we say you choose the mechanisms through the opportunities that one is presented with in the interactions with others and the environment. In other words, it is a dynamic interaction of energetic fields. You understand, it is a resonance and a music. And the music comes from all of the instruments playing their part. Do you understand what I mean?
So in terms of the agreements that are created before we are birthed into solid form, is things like our life purpose or our gift designed in that stage?
Some of the choices of gifts and challenges. In other words, one would not be wise, shall we say, to incarnate into a body that does not have a gift that is capable of overcoming a challenge. You understand? So you have within you all that is needed to create your purpose, to fulfill your purpose. That is the word I'm looking for. You have everything within to fulfill your purpose. And the purpose, of course, is always to evolve consciousness. And one evolves consciousness by attaining new perceptions and, shall we say, realizing that the challenge itself is the gift. That as soon as one has, shall we say, overcome the challenge, one has generated a new resource, a new gift that, shall we say, is useful to overcome even greater challenges.
So is that why we feel in life sometimes that we are going from one challenge to another, to another?
Of course. What a wonderful experience. You understand? It is only the mind that wants to have peace and calm. And if you are given peace and calm, you would also be met with the challenge of boredom. So you would go out and create some conflict. What a beautiful thought. Do you understand what I mean? Because you are not here to simply enjoy and have no growth. What would a plant do if it had no growth?
Die.
Of course.
So is this the same with the new children then? Are they, by design, learning their gifts through each challenge and will be offered one challenge after the other as well?
Of course, but they are not individual. That is, they are not seeking to be apart. They are a unified group. They are meeting the challenges of, shall we call them, environmental. Such challenges are not unique challenges. They are not day to day. They are of great concern to every one of them. So they are learning how to operate as a unified group. Do you understand? They are like a body working together. Each muscle is working at its peak in order to arrive at, shall we say, the greatest outcome, the greatest output. So if you are, shall we say, racing in the Olympic, you are hoping your body and all the muscles will be on form. They will operate exactly on time, not a microsecond before necessary. So the maximum output can be achieved, and you practice and practice to have the nervous system trigger all of this and the, shall we call it, the digestive system transfer the energy towards the muscles that must operate at peak efficiency. Do you understand it as a unified pattern? So the individual now is operating peak form as a unified field where all different elements are coming together in their most efficient method.
Fantastic. Thank you. Now, I was wondering if we can talk briefly about Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Can you give us any guidance on how that's impacting the world and whether it's positive and perhaps predictable?
Shall we say this? Coins are a method of transferring value. That is all it is. It is an agreement that if I provide you with this, you will provide me with this to purchase something that I need. So it is simply a way of transferring material. You understand, a balancing quality. What occurred with coinage, of course, was humans always seem to fall towards what is the ultimate evilness, which is greed. So this one wants to cheat this one over here. So this one, shall we say, puts a little bit of lead in their gold. So it now weighs the same, but is not of the same value. So the gold becomes less and less pure. Do you understand what I mean? So the purity is lost, and no one can any longer trust anyone else. So you try to make different coinage. You try to make a material that, shall we say, relates to pure gold. You put the pure gold somewhere where no one can get at it to exchange it for the lead. Then you print a piece of paper that says, this is worth this much pure gold. All is good, all is good, until there is only the piece of paper and no pure gold. It is just a piece of paper promising empty promises. Now you can print more and more and more empty promises. Of course, you're always being filled with empty promises. So someone comes up with a new idea, a new way of limiting empty promises. Nobody who is in the business of empty promises likes the idea that someone can promise something that has a limit to it. And that is where your cryptocurrencies lie. It is what happens when there is no trust in the world. Nobody trusts anybody else. Then you are caught up in the ultimate of all, which is endless lies, more and more and more lies. All of it is designed to take advantage of each other. Do you understand what I'm saying? So even in the world of your cryptocurrencies, it is filled with lies, filled with promises, empty, of course, because nobody is trustworthy. Until humankind realize that the trustworthiness leads to the destruction of their environment and, of course, the elimination of the species itself. And that is why the new species comes into being, because they cannot be lied to, because they are reading the field. Do you understand? They know who they can trust and who to, shall we say, do business with. Those who are honest. Do you understand? Honesty then comes about. And do you need any currencies at all, or do you need just a ledger? A ledger which says this one has this amount and this one owes that amount. Do you understand what I mean? And so it is that while the currency of cryptos is, shall we say, the same as all the others, the basis on which the ledger is organized gives a quality that is reliable to all. Do you understand what I mean? So one cannot simply print, one cannot cheat, because the very structure of the ledger is capable of keeping track of what is there. Does this answer the question?
Yeah, so Bitcoin's not, and other cryptocurrencies, not our answer to our...
I want to say your blockchain is the answer, the ledger is the answer.
Okay.
How you manage that, that is the important thing. When everyone agrees on one ledger that is unified across the globe as the one ledger that cannot be used for criminal activities. You understand, criminal activities are what you would call the outright criminal, and shall we call them the white collar criminal, that is the political criminals that you are filled with. You understand, all of this methods of making money by cheating others, that will only generate more and more different cryptocurrency or blockchain mechanisms, because nobody trusts any single one, because it is manipulated. Do you understand? As soon as there is an agreement that nothing can be made from nothing, you understand that one has to give something in order to gain something in one's account. And that is not counting it up. That is not giving anything, because the very ledger itself counts it all. It does not need people to make money counting up the ledger. Do you understand what I mean? And so all of the, shall we call them, the industries that are based on, shall we call them, the phase of cheat, that is, all the mechanisms designed to take from others without producing anything. Because there is no need for that when, shall we say, the law is set and the accounting is done by the ledger itself. Then all you might have are those that oversee and check that the ledger is not being abused. And if that occurs, all they have to do is reverse the ledger. No one can make anything if the ledger remains intact. You understand what I mean? And so I said before that the cryptocurrency market is another one of the markets that simply is unnecessary. Do you understand what I mean?
I do. Thank you. Very interesting. I was wondering if we have a brief moment to discuss if there's any updates on the Ukraine and Russia. Do you have any more guidance on that subject for us?
The conflict in the world is exactly the same conflict. Who can trust whom? As if two giant powers are struggling and one of them should be in the right. Of course not. They are both attempting to give themselves greater power. However, the conflict is unnecessary and is disturbing for the entire planet. There are greater concerns if one was to address the serious difficulties that come about when economies are simply based on producing weapons of mass destruction. I am not talking about nuclear weapons or such, like I am talking about military weapons that are used to mass destruct entire populations. And it is not one-sided at all. If one were to turn all the cameras on, one would see equal amount of abuses and destructions. So it is, shall we call it, the final conclusion of history. As I pointed out, the shift in consciousness does not happen willingly. It happens as the result of stupidity. And I wish to say this conflict is the peak of stupidity. Not that it is stupid per se, as it were, but it is stupid because it is self-destructive. Both sides will reach self-destruction before they can end. And we are not talking about the Ukraine. That one is irrelevant. They are the pawn, and that is all.
I know that you don't do predictions, but do you see the energy flowing in the direction where this is going to become more, more momentum that we don't want?
Let us say this. Everyone is waking up. Everyone is starting to see it is not quite as it seems. And one has to be much, much more aware of the overall impact of one's personal decisions. You understand what I mean? Otherwise, you will, of course, gain the results of one's own actions. One will meet self as always the case. And if the self is destructive, then you will meet the destruction.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add for today?
Enough. Then once again, thank you for your time and your work. I want to say this. Your interpretations are so useful in the context of our work together. So thank you and good afternoon.